Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming for today's joint presentation between EDUCAUSE and Devicat Consulting regarding change enablement. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Nicole, do you want to give a little bit of an introduction about who and what we are?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Nicole Arbino. I'm a communities program manager with EDUCAUSE. And at EDUCAUSE, we have about 72 public-facing community groups. So our goal with our community groups is for the community, by the community. And what we do as program managers and EDUCAUSE liaisons to those groups is we kind of keep our ear to the ground as to what do we hear that the community needs. And in a community group, when we hear, oh, I wish I had this toolkit, this product, whatever the thing is, then we spin up a working group of folks who are interested in creating whatever that product might be. And in the case of this group, we wanted to help institutions become more efficient through digital transformation with change enablement and DevOps. And we really needed a better way to manage a massive influx of applications and complexity of technology. So we put together this great group. We've got folks from University of Utah, we've got Hank, Lucas, Craig, and Todd. They've been the main group, and then we've had some other folks working as well. So that's how we really ended up at this point in creating this product specifically for the field.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Appreciate that. When we look at what's happening with IT in the world today, IT is technology is beginning to mature, and we're following similar cycles that have been seen in other industries, like the electrical grid, like the oil and gas sector, where our practices and our tools are maturing, but at the same time, the amount of global GDP that is being digitized has gotten pretty enormous. And I have this simple chart here to show you that since the advent of the first generation of the computing machine to today, IDC is projecting that 65% of the world global domestic product will be digitized in some form or another, meaning some part of 65% of what we do to produce goods and services involves IT in one way or another. And this is amounted to an enormous growth in the number of software engineers worldwide, where it's estimated that there are 28 million software engineers managing over 11 billion lines of code as an estimate in 2019. And I think that estimate is probably low because they're probably not considering things like automotive and other forms of manufacturing where there are many thousands of lines or millions and billions of lines of code in that as well. Perhaps we should begin by talking about what DevOps is. DevOps is not it's not a tool. It's not a software program. It's not Terraform. It's not Ansible. It's not Azure DevOps. DevOps is a combination of the cultural philosophies, practices, and tools that help you to deliver your solutions more rapidly, with higher velocity, with higher accuracy, and more security at a lower cost versus traditional software and infrastructure management processes. This description came right off of AWS, and we in this EDUCAUSE working group agree with this philosophy. And what is DevOps to my organization? Well, DevOps is not a framework per se, although there are those who will argue that it is becoming a framework. But DevOps is a model that you employ for continuous integration and continuous development in your organization. and the DevOps model that you implement is the one that should be right and custom fit for your organization. But before venturing down the DevOps role, you have to consider, road, I should say, you have to consider this. What value am I going to get by implementing DevOps? And I'm going to read this through Mark Smalley's book. This quote came out and he allowed me to modify it a little bit. So the commonly encountered continuous centric application of DevOps improves speed of delivery, meaning we go faster, and the resilience of IT services, so we're more reliable, resulting in faster return on investment and functionality and fewer costly disruptions to business operations, aka lower risk, and a better customer service experience that reduces the risk of stagnant or falling enrollment and reduces the risk of declining growth. Broadly speaking, DevOps principles should involve functional and technical units. And when you do that, you go faster and you increase your return on the investment by adopting an agile DevOps culture in your organization. DevOps has three principles: principle of flow, the principle of feedback, and the principle of continuous learning and experimentation. The principle of flow, first of all, the flow of work goes from development to downstream processes. And it requires transformative leadership practices. And in a DevOps organization, your organizational structure and your cultural structure is flattened. You increase the productivity because you're reducing what we call the batch sizes, or the size of your changes. So the scope of each change is reduced, but you have a larger volume of changes that are flowing through your DevOps process. Thus, velocity increases, but you also, as part of the principle of flow, you need to increase the visibility with tools, practices, and with leadership that increases the visibility of all of the work that everyone is doing, whether that work is in development or in a downstream process. And in a DevOps model, everybody owns the code, and that includes security, that includes operations, that includes development, that includes functional people who are testing. We all own this, and we all have skin in the game. In the principle of feedback, we have quality checkpoints that are strategically placed into the practices and into the value stream that give developers and others rapid feedback when either good or bad feedback, meaning good, this feature is doing what I want, or bad, this is a defect, or this feature doesn't meet my needs, or something else. And in the principle of feedback, we have security. We move security in the development stream upstream rather than downstream into the process, which holds the promise of reducing security defects when we release new products. Because our batch sizes are smaller, when we get feedback and we need to fix a program defect, developers can fix a problem faster versus a monolithic approach to pushing out releases. And feedback can come from any source, which could include the internet, it can include end users, it can include internal functional users and leaders. It can be anywhere in the organization. And with the principle of continuous learning and experimentation, that is very dependent on feedback loops. And at a simplest level, we learn when we fix our mistakes, But at the highest levels, organizations allocate time, money, and resources to experimentation and innovation within the DevOps model. At AWS, for instance, 20 and Amazon, 20% of an engineer's time is allocated for experimentation and learning. But the choosing learning and innovation paths must add value to the product stream. There is a high tolerance for failure, though, with experimentation and learning, but that has to be coupled to very high competency standards in the engineering staff, in the management staff, and the operations staff. What does DevOps need for success in an organization? We believe it requires change in the culture of the organization, and that's the most important thing. Without a commitment to change your organizational structure, you will fail in trying to implement a DevOps culture. You should have advocacy and change advocates. We're working with a large school right now who has actually reassigned someone to be their DevOps advocate, and we're so excited about the foresight of that. The organization needs to have agility, and you need to have the right tool set to support agility. And you need to have strong leadership at the team and at all executive levels. DevOps needs visibility, transparency, trust and accountability, really good communication, the feedback loops that we talked about before, and understanding what the downstream risk is when we introduce new change into the product value stream. The changing role of DevOps in the organization is having a major impact on infrastructure and operations, where you see development is managing a digital portfolio. And you can see infrastructure as code and product teams pushing out into what was traditional infrastructure and operations, but also pushing against infrastructure and operations is cloud platform automations and IT operations automations. And now I'd like to turn it over to Lucas to talk about change enablement. And Lucas, just tell me when you want me to advance the slide. Please go ahead.
I believe actually Hank Craig was going to talk about change enablement.
I stand corrected. Thank you.
That's right.
Oh, no
Probably caught Lucas a little flat there. So I'm Craig Benyon. I'm from the University of Utah. I started our service management program at the university several years ago, and currently one of the hats that I wear is that of a change manager. I'm just kind of curious, if you want to use the reactions in your Zoom window, how many of you are doing DevOps in some form right now? Okay. So there's a couple people out there. How many of you are looking at starting DevOps in some form? So there's a few there, and then my guess is that most everybody else is just interested in DevOps and change. So when we're talking about change, there are a lot of different names that sometimes are used when we talk about change. Sometimes we talk about it as change management, change control, change enablement. And really what we're doing is essentially we're managing changes to maximize the success of the changes that we implement. And so with change management, go ahead and let's go to the next slide. And I'll probably use those terms interchangeably. the real goal then with change management is to make sure that all the changes that we make deliver value to the customer and the organization by making sure those changes are successful. There's a lot of, there are several different frameworks that are out there for service management that incorporate change as a best practice. One of the most common ones is the IT infrastructure library, which is currently ITIL, referred to as ITIL-4. And with ITIL-4, they've kind of introduced a new framework that's based around two major constructs. The first one is referred to as the service value system that looks holistically at the service environment. And the second construct is something that's referred to as the 4 dimensions that looks at organizations and people, the information and technology aspects of services, partners and suppliers who we work with to provide services, and then the processes and service value streams. And again, these are all focused on what do we need to do to provide service or provide value to the business in form of services. And so the service value system has a couple different pieces. The first piece is referred to as guiding principles. The second piece is governance. The third is the service value chain. And then best practices, which is where change enablement falls, and then continual improvement. So let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. At the heart of the service value system is the service value chain. And this, it's not the official ITIL diagram you see, but this represents all the different components of the service value chain, where we look at demand and what are the activities that are necessary to create a product that delivers value. And so that diagram basically shows what these different activities are. Yeah, so let's just go to the next slide. When we're talking about change, really what we're talking about are methods and processes that allow the organization to make changes quickly and efficiently. And so with change, we want to make sure that our services are planned, that we've evaluated the risks properly, that we've involved all the stakeholders as part of this process. And really for me, the key thing about change is we need to be balancing and managing the risks that are associated with change. Change as a process is in my view, fairly straightforward. I think of it in terms of 4 different components, and there's a slide that'll show this later on. It's not the next one, but it'll be in a couple slides. And with the change, essentially somebody's got to request the change. Somebody or some group needs to review the change, evaluate it. There's some kind of authorization process that happens, and then part of change also kind of coordinates the implementation. It doesn't actually, it's not responsible for doing the implementation, but kind of watches over what's happening and makes sure that all the right things are happening in the way they need to. One of the ways, an analogy rather, that I like to think of as far as change goes, is the air traffic control system. If you think about how that works, a pilot doesn't just get in a plane and take off and go wherever they want. The first thing they need to do is they need to file a flight plan. And then that gets reviewed, the plan is authorized, and then the pilot, once they have permission, goes through and make sure the plane's airworthy, has all the things that they need, and then they work with the air traffic control tower for takeoff, in-flight instructions and directions, and then again, as they land, working with the air traffic controller, making sure that they can land safely and effectively. And so with change, that request process is like filing the flight plan. The review process is somebody reviewing it, and then authorization, and then coordinating the things that happen in flight is that coordination piece. So when we think about change, it really, for me, it's what are the risks that are associated at all those different places and points, and how do we manage them appropriately so we can make the changes that we need to. With change management or change enablement, there are some different roles that are associated with it. Hank, do you want to advance to the next slide? Some of the different roles, there's usually a change manager that kind of oversees the process itself. You have a change authority. Change authority is an entity which can either be a person or it could be a group that's empowered to accept the risks associated with the change and is held accountable if the change fails. And I think one of the key things that people sometimes miss out on with change is we want to have that change authority as close to where the changes are being implemented as we can, and that those people have the right authority. The greater the risk, the more authority or power that person needs to have. So if we're doing routine kinds of things, we want to put the change authority as close to where the changes are happening. If we're making large changes that require large budget or large resources, that would be made at much higher levels in the organization. Another role that's part of change is a change advisory board. This is a group of stakeholders that work with the change manager and the change authority in reviewing the changes, making sure that they're properly vetted and we've accounted for the risks that are associated with the change. And then we have the change implementers, the change requesters. So those are some of the different roles that are associated. One thing to keep in mind that I think is important to keep in mind is as you're doing changes or making changes, it's important to realize that the process you use needs to meet the needs of your organization. I think sometimes we get trapped into thinking of change as this cookie cutter process where you have to do this, and this, and that's not always the case. Let's go to the next slide, Hank. So if you think about what are the things that we need for change to be successful, we need supportive leadership. We need feedback loops. So as we're making the changes, as we're trying to work with the risks, mitigate risks, we need the feedback loops so that we are informed about what's going on. There has to be trust and accountability in the organization. Stakeholder participation is, in my opinion, a critical thing that's part of change. And when we talk about stakeholders, it's not just within the technical organization, but we need to include our customers and our users to make sure that as we make these changes, one is it delivers the benefit that those customers and users are interested in, and we do it in a way that doesn't disrupt the business too much. Communication is a critical aspect where we need to constantly keep people informed about what's going on. Change champions, people that one, champion the process, and two, can champion the changes themselves. A remediation plan. No change should be implemented without some sort of a remediation plan. If this fails, what are we going to do? How are we going to handle it? Distributor delegated change authority. Again, we want to make sure that the people that are authorizing changes are empowered so that they can be accountable for mitigating and dealing with the risks that are associated with the changes. We need to be able to understand the risks, and we need to make sure that we have the proper controls at the right place. And so if we compare, and Hank, I don't know if you want to join in on this one or not, but as you compare what the needs are for both DevOps and change enablement to be a success, you can see that they're very similar.
And in many organizations, we've seen conflict between developers and development teams and change enablement teams. And as we study the research and as we look at what we're doing in our organizations and each other's organizations, we find that there are more similarities and more complements where the DevOps model and the ITIL-4 change enablement framework can really be joined together and can work cohesively together. But we've also found, having studied a number of research papers, that DevOps without the structure of change enablement produces lesser quality software and more security defects, and introduces more risk into the organization. So we believe that DevOps should be coupled with the ITIL-4 framework and with change enablement to maximize the success of it in your organization. So go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, Hank. So this is that diagram that I was referring to earlier, where we have a typical change process that's over here on the right side. And when we're thinking about changes and the service value chain, we need to keep in mind that different types of changes probably need to be handled a little differently. There are some types of changes in our organizations that are more operational in nature. They're routine, they're well documented, there's low risk. We understand what the risks are. We have ways of mitigating those risks. And so for those kinds of things, it may not be necessary to go through all the different steps that are outlined there. Maybe what happens is for these routine kinds of changes, in ITIL, they're typically referred to as a standard change. There just needs to be an authorization, and then we go ahead and implement. On other changes that are more complex, that are more involved, that have greater impact to the organization, have higher risk, those are changes that probably need to go through a more comprehensive review, where we do a formal request, we do a formal review. There might be a business plan associated with making the request. And then the authorization needs to happen at the right place in the organization, which would probably be with IT leadership, or even higher if it's a whole organization impacting. But the key is making sure that as we're looking at changes, we understand the different types of changes we make in the organization, and the level of authority that's required to accept the risks to move forward with those changes. The service value chain that's over on the left, the purpose of that is to help people think through what are the things that need to happen as we go about making changes. So, for example, if we're doing a simple type of change, that it's well understood. If it's a standard change, it might be the only thing we need to do is somebody needs to request it. And so that's where the engage or request would happen in the engage portion. And then we can go straight to implementation, which is deliver and support, to create the value. For more complex changes, it might require a lot more effort. So a request is made, maybe it needs to go through a planning exercise. Once the planning's done, it comes back to make sure that we've done the needs requirement. From there, it might go to design, where we actually design the service, and then back to engage to work with stakeholders. And so the service value chain really helps us create a model as a value stream, if you will, of activities to make sure that for the kinds of things we're doing, we're accounting for all the different activities that need to take place. So just really high level with change there.
So this is Hank stepping back in. In a DevOps model, a typical model, we interface with a change approval process where we develop a new feature, a new package, or we're deploying a new container, and we enter the change control process with, is this a high risk or a low risk change? If it's low risk, then typically the team approves it, or the team lead, or the manager. And if it's a high risk, then it goes in front of a cab. And this is a point of contention for developers who want to move really, really fast, but also is an area of contention for change enablement advocates, because many people on the change control side are perceived by DevOps people as slowing things down, and a number of people on the ITIL side, on the change enablement side, perceive that DevOps wants to go willy-nilly, just push out changes and not have any kind of risk management. But when it works with the most common model that we've seen, the changes flow through the approval process, and then you've got a DevOps blue-green model where blue is active and green is inactive. Your containers or some other piece of technology is running active in blue, and then if you need to roll back, then you just flip over to green, and now you've rolled everything back in moments. Where we think this needs to change is, instead of the change approval process being downstream in the workflow process, we believe it needs to be brought upstream, where a planning committee reviews new features or new change into the organization and goes through an approval process, at which point the development team develops that particular change, and it goes through a peer quality review process, and then the final approver of the quality review process approves that release, and that release then pushes out. And certainly if it's a very high risk kind of a change, then in that planning committee, that's where your planning committee works out on what the risks are, what's the upside, what's the downside, and then submits that through the change approval process, whether that be an executive level cab or a lower level cab. And we tend to believe that this would flow more rapidly in the organization. And in my organization, we've played around with doing it this way. But with respect to implementing this successfully, having the feedback loops are critical. And here we show an example of the continuous feedback from feedback loops, where you'd have a feedback loop in development, you have feedback loops in test areas, and then in staging, you've got your functional users that are engaged in testing, or you may have some testing automation running as well. And then in production, you've got continuous monitoring and you've got a feedback loops there as well. So where are we going next with this? We're going to be drafting a paper, an EDUCAUSE paper, and we're going to be looking for peer reviewers for that paper. And during that peer review process, we'll refine the paper and then publish it on EDUCAUSE with the other research papers that EDUCAUSE has produced. And for those of you who are familiar with that process, you already know about the large number of excellent works that are posted there. I'm going to stop the screen share. And this is where we would like to be able to open up the last few minutes, the last 8 minutes that we have for open discussion within the group. And we would really appreciate some feedback with respect to what we think the current model is and what you think the current model is and what your opinion is of moving that approval process and the planning process to the head rather than the tail of the development pipeline.
And if you have any questions in general, either about DevOps or change, if you're thinking about it, maybe you don't know as much as you'd like to. Anyway, any questions? That's the bottom line. It's a quiet group today.
Yes, it is. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming. We appreciate your attendance and we hope to hear from you after we post this. I'll be in touch with those of you when I get the attendee list to see if I can get some more feedback. So with that much said, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole for closing us out. Thank you. Go ahead, Nicole.
Absolutely, thanks. So thank you all so much for attending. This is a topic that we're really excited about. If you have any feedback that comes up in the meantime, if you have any light bulb moments after this, you can feel free to email me and I will put my email address in the chat.
Hank, do you want to bring up the last slide?
Sure.
One thing I'll say while Hank brings that up is that if this is a topic you're interested in engaging on more, we would love to have you. Our EDUCAUSE community groups are open. You don't have to be an EDUCAUSE member. It's just community spaces. If you have more questions like this, feel free to reach out to me and I can help you with getting access to that. But we have a lot of conversations around all things IT in our community groups, and we'd be happy to get you connected with one that would be most helpful to you.
And if you have questions, our contact information is there on the screen. And I think any of us would be willing to answer questions that you might have.
Well, thank you again, everyone.